You are not my daughter. The words sliced through the air like a blade. Ivy froze, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and devastation. Around her, the grandeur of the Quinn estate turned cold, like marble grave markers to a legacy she thought was hers. Not his daughter. Not a Quinn. Not an heir. A single sentence had erased everything. But beneath the shock, something ancient stirred, a secret buried too long. Stay. The truth is rising, and it won't be quiet. The chandeliers above glittered like frozen constellations, casting fractured light over the table where bloodlines were measured in cold precision. The Quinn estate, grand, old, and almost religious in its silence, held its breath. Death had come and gone, but power was still being passed like a torch through fire. Ivy Quinn stood at the far end of the long oak table, a porcelain cup untouched in her hand. Her blazer, black as morning, hugged her frame with military precision. Her eyes, dark, steady, scanned the room filled with cousins, uncles, and names that wielded influence like a weapon. But none of them mattered. Not today. Today was hers. She'd done everything right. Valedictorian at Penn Law. Clerked under a federal judge. Clean record. Iron will. She was the only one in this godforsaken family who deserved to inherit Eleanor Quinn's empire. Her grandmother had said so herself. Not with warmth, Eleanor never offered that, but with something better, respect. And now. It was time. Let's begin, Douglas Quinn said, voice even, unreadable. He looked like the room, expensive, controlled, and as warm as polished stone. Ivy met his eyes. Her stomach turned. Something was off. He wasn't avoiding her gaze. He was preparing for something. Harrison Mills, the family attorney, cleared his throat and began the formalities. Legal terms danced in the air: estate allocation, primary succession, bloodline rights. Then, like a blade slid quietly between ribs, Douglas raised a hand. Before we proceed, there is something that must be clarified. The air shifted. Conversations stilled. Even the rain outside seemed to pause on the window panes. Regarding Ivy, he said, there has been a long-standing misunderstanding. Ivy blinked. A spike of heat crawled up her neck. What the hell are you talking about? He didn't answer her. He spoke to the room. Ivy Quinn is not my biological daughter. Silence. Not silence like peace. Silence like impact. Like breath knocked out of lungs. Like the world cracking down the middle. Ivy stared at him, motionless. Say that again. You heard me, he said. Cold. Certain. You are not of my blood. Therefore, you do not qualify for inheritance under the Quinn lineage provision outlined in Eleanor's will. That's a lie. Her voice cracked, but not with fear, with fury. You're doing this to shut me out. You've always hated that she trusted me more than you. Don't flatter yourself, Douglas said, barely looking at her. This has nothing to do with trust. It's simple genetics. Her cup shattered against the floor. So for 28 years, you let me believe I was your daughter. You let me call you Dad. You let me suffer through this family's twisted hierarchy, just to rip it all away now. Her mother, seated quietly by Douglas's side, flinched. But she said nothing. Mom? Ivy's voice cracked again, softer now. Desperate. Tell him he's lying. Tell them I'm his daughter. Silence. Please. Still nothing. Her mother's eyes brimmed, but her lips remained sealed. You knew, Ivy whispered. You've always known. Douglas stood, buttoning his blazer. The truth doesn't care how you feel about it. You're not a Quinn by blood. That's all that matters. He turned away. Something in her broke wide open. Not just from the betrayal, but from the realization that she'd never truly belonged. Not at this table. Not in this name. Not in this family. She wasn't being disinherited. She was being erased. But even as the ground crumbled beneath her, a single thought burned hot through the ruin. Then who the hell is my father? The hallway outside the parlor felt colder than usual, like the air itself had recoiled from what just happened. Ivy stood frozen for a moment, one hand braced against the wall, the other clenched into a fist. Her heels echoed like gunshots as she stormed down the corridor, silk curtains billowing behind her. She didn't knock. She shoved open the door to her mother's private sitting room, eyes wild, voice shaking. "You're going to tell me the truth. Right now." Vivienne Quinn sat at her vanity, back turned, brushing her hair with mechanical grace. She didn't flinch. "Ivy, please, this isn't the time." "Don't you dare," Ivy snapped. "Don't you dare try to play gentle now. You sat there and said nothing while he carved me out, like I was a stranger in my own skin." Vivienne set the brush down with a soft click. "Because I knew what he was going to say," she whispered. Ivy's breath caught. "So it's true." Her mother turned, slowly, and for the first time, looked her full in the eyes. Her face was pale, drawn. "Haunted." "Yes." The word shattered what little strength Ivy had left. She staggered back a step, like the air had been punched from her lungs. "Who?" she whispered. "Who is my real father?" Vivienne's lip trembled. For a moment, she looked like she might lie, might pull the same silence that had destroyed everything at that table. But then something cracked in her. Shame, perhaps. Or regret too heavy to carry. "James," she said. "James Quinn." Silence. Ivy blinked. "Uncle James." Vivienne nodded slowly. "He was never just your uncle. He was the man I loved." The room tilted. The name hit like a delayed detonation, slow, deep, and all-consuming. "You loved him. We were young. And reckless. And stupidly happy." Her mother's voice grew distant, tangled in memory. "But the family wouldn't allow it. Not with James. He wasn't obedient enough. Not like Douglas. So they exiled him." Vivienne nodded. "They said if I didn't end it, I'd be disowned. James refused to play the family's games. So they pushed him out. And Douglas. Douglas was waiting. He offered me a way to stay. To survive. He married me before anyone could know I was pregnant. And you let me grow up thinking he was my father. He raised you." "No, Mother, he tolerated me." Ivy's voice cracked again, venom mixing with grief. "He looked at me like I was a blemish. A threat." Vivienne turned away, tears slipping silently down her cheek. "James never knew. I didn't tell him." "You robbed both of us," Ivy said, barely above a whisper. "And now he's a stranger I've never met. And he's the only person left in this goddamn family who might not lie to me." Vivienne choked back a sob. "He's in Seattle. Still a doctor. He writes sometimes." I never answered. Ivy turned, grabbing her coat off the chair. "Where are you going?" "To find my father," she said without looking back. "The real one." 2 days later, she stood alone in a quiet cafe in downtown Seattle. Her fingers drummed against the table, restless and uncertain. The door opened, and the man who walked in carried the weight of years in his shoulders and something else. Eyes that looked just like hers. He paused when he saw her. then slowly walked over, disbelief flickering in his face. "Ivy." She stood, nodded once. "Hi. Dr. Quinn." He smiled gently. "Call me James." And just like that, the truth began to take shape, one quiet breath at a time. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air in the private clinic, a stark contrast to the chaos simmering beneath Ivy's composed surface. She sat in the examination room, jaw locked tight, as the nurse swabbed the inside of her cheek. Across from her, James sat still, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on nothing. He hadn't asked for proof. He didn't need it. But he had agreed, for her sake. "How long will it take?" she asked, her voice a clipped whisper. 3 days, the nurse replied gently. "We'll expedite it." When they were alone again, Ivy exhaled sharply. "If this comes back positive, and it will, we take it straight to court." James looked at her with something like pride, but also sadness. "You don't have to fight this alone, you know." "I've always fought alone," she replied. "This time, I just have sharper teeth." Back in Philadelphia, shadows moved behind marble walls. In a corner office of the Quinn building, Douglas leaned over a desk piled with papers, his fingers tapping against polished mahogany. Harrison Mills stood beside him, sweat glistening beneath his collar despite the air-conditioned chill. "She's in Seattle," Harrison said. "We have confirmation she met with James." Douglas didn't look up. "Then she knows. And if she gets proof, if she gets that DNA test, then we burn it," Douglas said flatly. "We delay the reading. We discredit the girl. Make her look unstable. Emotional. Desperate for money. You know the playbook. And Bernard Walsh. Keep him out of the loop." Eleanor was smart, but she trusted him too much. "If he's holding the real will." Douglas's lips curled into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Then we'll make sure no one ever sees it." But Ivy had already anticipated their moves. She stood outside Bernard Walsh's townhouse the next evening, coat buttoned tight, hair pulled back like she was going to war. He opened the door slowly, surprise flashing across his lined face. "Miss Quinn." "Ivy," she corrected. "I need your help. And I think you've been waiting for this moment as long as I have." Inside, the old lawyer poured her a glass of scotch, and sat across the table like a chess master finally allowed to make his move. "I've kept something locked away," he said. "A letter. A document. I was waiting for the right person to ask the right questions." Was it her real will? It was her final one. The only one that mattered. She didn't trust Douglas. And she knew, someday, the bloodline would be tested in ways no contract could withstand. Ivy leaned forward, voice low. "Then I need that will. And I need it before they bury it like they tried to bury me." The next morning, the news broke. A whisper campaign was underway. Anonymous sources. Strategic leaks. Ivy Quinn, unstable. Estranged from the family. Financially desperate, after being written out of the estate. She stared at her phone screen in silence, the headlines blinking like accusations. Then she calmly set it down and looked at James across the breakfast table. "They want a war." James nodded. "Then let's give them one." It started with a box. An old, forgotten box tucked in the back of Eleanor's personal storage, hidden beneath stacks of outdated ledgers and dusty photo albums in the family vault. Bernard Walsh, careful and deliberate, opened it with gloved hands. Ivy stood beside him, her heart thudding like war drums. Inside, letters, legal records, faded birth certificates, and one yellowed envelope with a wax seal bearing the Quinn crest. This isn't in any of the archives," Bernard murmured, eyes narrowing. She hid this. What is it? He handed her the envelope. Her name was written on it. In her grandmother's spidery, unmistakable handwriting. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside were 2 documents. One was a letter, handwritten, dated 2 years before Eleanor's death. The other, a birth certificate. Not hers. Not James's. Douglas's. Ivy read the first line and felt the floor tilt beneath her. Douglas Marcus Quinn, born to Marjorie and Ernest Collins. Adopted at 6 months old by Eleanor Quinn under private legal guardianship. Adoption sealed by court order. Non-disclosed. Her breath caught. Adopted. Bernard leaned in, pale as chalk. That means he's not a Quinn. James had just stepped into the room when he heard it. He took the paper from Ivy's hands and read it once. His face went cold. She knew, he said. She always knew Douglas wasn't her blood. That's why she clung so tightly to the clause. She was protecting the real lineage. Ivy's fingers closed around the second document, the one Bernard had kept hidden for so long. The real will. She opened it, every word like thunder in her skull. To my son, James Elias Quinn, I leave the controlling share of the Quinn Holdings estate. To my granddaughter Ivy, my only grandchild by blood, I leave full entitlement to my private trust, including the ancestral home, family jewels, and all assets unencumbered by board oversight. Her voice shook as she read the final lines aloud. Let the name Quinn fall only to those who carry its truth. Blood does not lie. Masks do. A long silence followed. Then James looked at Ivy, voice firm. We end this. Publicly. Meanwhile, in the towering boardroom of Quinn Holdings, Douglas stood at the head of the table, impeccably dressed, utterly in control. Harrison Mills sat beside him, legal folders neatly aligned. We've delayed the will long enough, Harrison said, low. If she pushes further, we risk court involvement. Douglas's eyes narrowed. Let her push. She's got nothing. A knock at the door. Then Bernard walked in. Behind him, James. And Ivy. All 3 stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes blazing with the weight of truth long suppressed. You shouldn't be here, Douglas said sharply. You shouldn't be standing here, Ivy replied. Because everything you built is about to collapse. She pulled a folder from her coat and laid it on the table. Inside, DNA results. The real will. And the adoption certificate. Douglas paled. This is fake, he growled. It's notarized, Bernard cut in. By your own legal counsel. Hidden under your mother's estate. James stepped forward, voice cutting like glass. You used bloodline as a weapon to disinherit Ivy. But you're not a Quinn by blood. You're not even her son. Murmurs broke out around the table. Board members glanced at each other, brows furrowed in shock and betrayal. Ivy leaned in, inches from Douglas's face. You said I didn't belong. That I wasn't enough. But the truth is, you were the lie all along. He opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. Because this time, the silence didn't protect him. It exposed him. The grand salon of the Quinn estate had never been more crowded, nor more volatile. Family members filled every corner, dressed in somber tones, murmuring behind crystal flutes of champagne that no one was really drinking. The chandelier above flickered slightly, like even the light hesitated to stay. At the center of it all stood Harrison Mills, stiff in his charcoal suit, holding a folder he gripped too tightly. To his left, Douglas, face unreadable, but eyes twitching at the corners. To his right, Vivienne, pale and distant, hands folded as if in prayer. And directly opposite them, Ivy, flanked by James and Bernard Walsh, each of them radiating quiet, measured fire. Harrison cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention. In accordance with the will of the late Eleanor Quinn, he began, voice clipped, and under the authority granted to me as legal counsel to the Quinn Family Trust, I must formally declare that Miss Ivy Quinn does not meet the requirements to be considered a legitimate heir. The room erupted in whispers. Ivy didn't flinch. The clause in question, Harrison continued, specifies that only direct descendants bearing the Quinn bloodline are eligible for inheritance, as determined by the family, and accepted by Mr. Douglas Quinn. Stop. Ivy's voice rang out, sharp and clean like glass breaking in a silent room. All heads turned. She stepped forward, lifted a white envelope from her bag, and placed it on the table between them. Before you bury me again, she said evenly, I suggest you open this. Harrison hesitated. Douglas leaned toward him, whispering something harsh. But Bernard stepped forward. It's a legal request, he said. Backed by a court-verified chain of custody. You open it, or I will. Harrison's lips thinned. He broke the seal. The room held its breath. What is it? Someone asked from the back. DNA results, Ivy said. Her voice didn't waver. Proving that James Quinn is my biological father. And that I, not Douglas's daughter, but James's, am of the Quinn bloodline. Gasps scattered like broken glass. Douglas straightened, furious. This is absurd, anyone can fake. Don't bother, James interrupted. His voice cut deeper than Ivy's. Because if we're talking bloodlines, then maybe we should talk about yours, Douglas. A second envelope landed on the table with a thud. Douglas Marcus Quinn, James said slowly, for the entire room to hear, was born to Marjorie and Ernest Collins. Adopted at 6 months by Eleanor Quinn. Legal guardianship sealed in a court order that was buried until now. The silence now wasn't shock, it was devastation. Old money, old pride, and old lies all crumbling at once. You used that clause to cut Ivy out, James continued, but by your own standard, you don't belong here either. Douglas's face went slack. Vivienne covered her mouth. He knew, Ivy added quietly. He's always known. That's why he worked so hard to hide the real will. The one where my grandmother, who knew exactly who carried her blood, named James as heir. And me as her only legitimate descendant. A chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. One of the board members stood up, red-faced and shaking. Is this true? Bernard raised the Real will, sealed and notarized. It is. And with that, the balance shattered. The dynasty that once tried to erase her now had no choice but to face her. The room had fallen into a stunned, almost sacred silence. Douglas sat slumped in his leather chair, as though the floor beneath him had given way. His knuckles, once white with control, now trembled faintly against the polished table. No one rushed to comfort him. Not Vivienne. Not Harrison. Not even the board. Ivy stood tall. Not triumphant, but steady. In control. Beside her, Bernard Walsh removed a smaller, worn envelope from his coat, its seal waxed, but cracked from age. He held it with something close to reverence. Before her death, he said softly, Mrs. Eleanor Quinn left behind one final note. It was never meant to be shared unless the truth was denied. He unfolded the paper slowly, and then began to read, his voice low, but clear enough for every soul in the room to hear. To those who would challenge what is known, understand this. The one who truly carries the Quinn name will never need to prove it. Because truth, in time, will always rise to defend itself. No forged paper, no false claim, no polished lie will outlive blood. James, my son, you were born from my heart, and you were cast out for refusing to kneel to a legacy that feared its own reflection. I see now that defiance was the truest mark of our bloodline. Anne Ivy, my granddaughter, you are my vengeance. Not with violence, but with clarity. They tried to erase you, but what is real cannot be undone. Let this be my last command. Let the house fall to the ones who carry truth, not just in their veins, but in their spine. Bernard folded the letter in silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then James stepped forward and placed the original will, signed, witnessed, and now impossible to ignore, on the table. As stated in Eleanor's final testament, Bernard continued, more formal now, the controlling shares of Quinn Holdings and the estate's principal assets will pass to Mr. James Quinn and Miss Ivy Quinn, effective immediately. The trust, personal holdings, properties, and philanthropic accounts will be jointly managed by them, under the provisions of Eleanor's legacy charter. Gasps. One board member stood to clap, once hesitant. Then another joined. And another. Douglas finally rose to his feet, his voice hoarse. This isn't over. You think a name and a letter makes you one of us. Ivy turned to him, her voice steady. I'm not one of you, Douglas. I never was. And thank God for that. James walked to his brother, handed him the adoption record without a word. Douglas didn't take it. The board has already convened, Bernard said firmly. Effective today, you are relieved of all executive duties. Your seat on the board is suspended pending full review of misconduct and suppression of estate documents. Douglas looked around the room, but no one met his eyes. He was no longer the predator. He was the exposed fraud in a house built on mirrors. As security approached to escort him out, he didn't resist. His fall wasn't loud. It was quiet, the kind of fall that echoed long after the footsteps faded. And as the heavy doors closed behind him, Ivy turned to face the room. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood, unshaken, undeniable. A Quinn. At last. The leaves in Philadelphia had just begun to turn, amber, crimson, gold, draping the Quinn estate in the kind of beauty that whispered of endings and beginnings. For the first time in years, the great hall was not filled with power plays or whispered betrayals. It was alive. Fresh flowers lined the foyer. Sunlight warmed the marble. And in the study, the heavy scent of dust and secrets had been replaced by the aroma of fresh coffee and quiet laughter. Ivy stood by the window, a steaming mug in hand, watching two men argue over where to hang an old family portrait. The frame is crooked, Thomas, William groaned. It's called character, Thomas shot back. Besides, Ivy likes it this way, right? She smirked without turning around. I like watching you two bicker more. Both men chuckled, really chuckled, not with pretense, but with ease. Ivy couldn't remember the last time she'd seen either of them so relaxed. For years, Thomas and William had stood on the periphery, aloof, distant, caught in their own corners of the Quinn machine. But since the truth came out, they had reached for her. And this time, she didn't hesitate to reach back. You're not alone here anymore, William had said just days before, gripping her shoulder. You never were, Thomas added quietly. Outside, James stood in the garden, carefully pruning a row of hydrangeas that had been neglected for years. He looked so at home there, calm, focused, gentle. Not the disgraced brother the family had cast out, but the man he was always meant to be. Ivy approached, hands in her pockets. I didn't know you gardened, she said. Your grandmother taught me, he replied with a small smile. Before she stopped letting me in the house. A beat of silence. Wind stirred the leaves around their feet, I hated you for not being there, Ivy admitted, her voice quiet. But now I see. You didn't walk away. You were pushed. James met her gaze. His eyes, the same shade as hers, held something new now, belonging. And you. You weren't just pushed. You were buried. But you dug your way out. She exhaled, the breath slow and full. It's strange. I spent my whole life fighting for a place in this family. And now that I have it, it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like clarity. He nodded. That's because it was never about the legacy. It was about the truth. Later that night, in Elena's old library, Ivy stood before the fireplace with the real will in her hands. The words no longer carried weight, they had already been fulfilled. But the letter. She held it like scripture. Blood does not lie. Masks do. Ivy smiled. She finally understood. The true inheritance wasn't the house, or the company, or the jewels locked behind 1,000 vaults. It was freedom. To choose who she loved. To choose who she fought for. And to finally, fully, choose herself. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, next to a framed photo of her and James taken just a week earlier, both laughing, mid-conversation, no need for posing. For the first time, she wasn't a footnote in someone else's story. She was the headline. Weeks passed. The storm faded. The dust settled. But the truth, once unearthed, never went back to sleep. The Quinn name still echoed in the press, but now it carried a different weight. A story of legacy, yes, but more than that, a story of reckoning. Of reclamation. Of one woman who refused to be erased. And at its center, Ivy. She no longer walked through the estate like a guest in someone else's home. She belonged now, not because of a surname, not because of a document, but because she chose to belong. On her terms. Her footsteps were calm. Her voice, measured. Her smile. Real. In one of her grandmother's old journals, she found a single line underlined 3 times. Power without truth is an empire built on sand. She smiled at that. Because now, she held both. One morning, as light poured through the east windows, Ivy sat in the garden beside James. They didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. Then she turned to him and said softly, "You know, I used to think family was just blood." James raised an eyebrow. And now? Now I know. Family is the people who don't leave, especially when it would have been easier to. He nodded. Truth has a way of pulling us back to each other, doesn't it? Ivy looked around, not at the legacy, not at the buildings, but at the people who remained. And in that moment, she understood. The real inheritance wasn't fortune. It was freedom. It was truth. It was love, chosen, not assigned. Truth can be hidden. But it can never be denied. Family is not just written in blood. But in honesty, in choice. And in love that dares to stay.